Welcome to this first lesson looking at London in the Second World War. This lesson will focus on the birth of bombing and why cities like London were selected as targets of the Second World War at all. For that reason, we're going to have to focus on some events that date before the Second World War to show why London was selected as a target by the German Air Force. The man in the photograph is a British politician from the 1930s, and a very prominent one. His name is Stanley Baldwin. We're going to have a look now at one of the quotes that he gave to Parliament in 1932, 8 years before London was bombed in the Second World War. "I think it is well also for the man in the street to realise that there is no power on earth that can protect him from being bombed. Whatever people may tell him, the bomber will always get through. The only defence is in the offence, which means that you have to kill more women and children more quickly than the enemy if you want to save yourselves." Pretty grim reading. Here's a do now task. Read the quote by British politician Stanley Baldwin. He said it in Parliament in 1932. Summarise why Baldwin's opinion in a sentence or two. What was he actually saying? Then explain why Baldwin may be correct in his assumption that the bomber will always get through. And then thirdly, explain why Baldwin may be incorrect. Pause the video now while you attempt that. Well, hopefully we've identified that Baldwin's opinion is that bomber technology had advanced so far that there was no way of stopping them from bombing cities. This is envisaging a time in which bombers would be able to roam at will over cities, bombing and terrorising civilians. A pretty terrifying prospect in 1932, as it would be today. So why might Baldwin be correct? Well, indeed, bomber technology had been used in the First World War and had bombed London. Since then, bombers only got larger, faster and got heavier bomb loads, so it followed that the bombing of cities that would follow in a serious war would be even worse than that suffered by London during the Zeppelin and Gotha bomber attacks of World War I. Indeed, it is worth remembering that the first London Blitz was during World War I by German airships and biplane bombers. Secondly, why may he be correct? Well, how are they going to stop them? The technology of the time would not necessarily give them advanced warning enough to stop the bombers who would be climbing at altitude. Certainly bombers being developed in the early 1930s was fast enough to escape most of the fighters of the time. Also, there was no early warning device other than simply being able to listen and look out for the bombers as they approached. Why might he be incorrect then? Well, Baldwin is making the assumption that technology would not be developed that would end up tackling these things. We've got to remember that by the time London was being bombed in 1940, technology had advanced quite substantially. The fastest RAF fighter in 1932 had a top speed of a little under 200 miles an hour. By 1940, Spitfires had a top speed of 350 miles an hour. Not only that, the bombers had advanced by 1940, but the fighter technology had very much overtaken them in terms of speed and performance. Not only that, there was early warning of bombers by 1940 in the form of radar and organised defence systems to stop them. Not to mention anti-aircraft guns that had also improved by that point. But let's consider why people like Baldwin might have had some reason and justification to fear bombing from the air. Have a look at this picture of an RAF bomber of the era. It's called the Handley Page Hayford, and it's being attacked by an RAF Hawker Demon fighter. It's a pretty ungainly thing, and fairly similar to the bombers of the First World War. Although this one had a metal construction, it was still covered largely with fabric, and it would cruise along at under 200 miles an hour. Then have a look at this one. This is a bomber of the Second World War, and a typical one that attacked London, the Heinkel HE-111. Developed in 1934 and first flown in 1935, it was streamlined, it was faster than any bombers and fighters that the RAF then possessed, and was being billed as an airliner. Yes, that's right, Germany was banned from building bombers at this time, but they decided to build them anyway under the guise as airliners. It just so happened that this particular airliner, the Heinkel 111, was able to be fitted with bomb racks and machine guns, and flown as a bomber, and it did so quite successfully. Where did the Heinkel make its debut then? Well, it wasn't bombing London, as we will see. This is a very famous painting. The original is black and white too, so I'm not showing you a bad copy of it here. It was painted by famous modern artist Pablo Picasso, who was Spanish by birth, and he called it Guernica. This painting has got various elements to it which make it shocking, and it's actually a painting that represents an air attack. But how, you might ask? Well, let's consider some elements of this painting. First of all, consider the bull, one of the national animals of Spain. It's standing there in blank shock. More graphically still, we can see a mother cradling a dead child, wailing in agony at the air. You might also notice at her feet a dead body. We also have an enigmatic image in the air, like an eye with a light bulb in it. It's not quite clear what this represents, but it's possible that it represents the new technology of the time, like an all-seeing eye in the sky, much like a bomber. Here we see a person trapped in a burning building, a clear result of the bombing. And on the ground a severed arm holding a broken sword, representative of the fact that at this time there was no defence against aerial bombing. And a screaming horse, an agonising image of the pain and torment that Spain was suffering. Again, the horse being a national animal of Spain. So what was Guernica? Why did Picasso feel inspired to paint this image? Well, let's find out. Guernica, 1937. An ominous beginning. The image at the bottom of the screen here is a photograph of Guernica after a very famous, or rather infamous, attack by nationalist forces during the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War was a civil war between the Republican forces and nationalist forces. They had different political ideas, and the purpose of this video is not to go into detail as to the causes of the Spanish Civil War. But put it this way, the nationalist forces were backed up by their ideological allies, the Nazis from Germany. Hitler didn't only assist in the training and equipping of Franco's nationalist forces, he also sent his own air force and soldiers out there to fight for him. Why? Because he wanted them to get war experience before the war that Hitler already knew was coming. In 1937, as part of the Spanish Civil War, German-built and crewed aircraft devastated the city of Guernica in Spain. Your first task relates to a video, the link to which can be found in the description. What can this video tell us about the raid? Make some notes about the experiences of the survivors of Guernica. Bear with it, some of the accents are quite difficult to understand, but there's a clear translation too. Secondly, how would British civilians be likely to react to the news of Guernica in 1937? Might they have expected the same thing to happen to them if they ended up in a war? Then as an extension, consider this. The bombing of Guernica probably killed about 240 people, which of course is terrible. But in 1937, the estimates were of up to 6,000 deaths. What might explain this great difference in opinions? Pause the video now, complete your answers, and have a watch of the video that's linked in the description. Pause now. Okay, what did we come up with? Hopefully we picked up some of the shock that the survivors had at seeing dead people for the first time. After all, many of the people being interviewed in 2008 were only children at the time of the bombing of Guernica. You may also have picked up about the destruction of the bombers machine gunning people on the ground, bombing bridges, bombing buildings, setting fire to buildings and so forth. How would British civilians be likely to react to the news? Well, they'd likely be very scared. If that could happen to Guernica, perhaps it could happen to Birmingham or London next. This was a sign that perhaps the predictions of politicians like Stanley Baldwin were maybe true. And that last point about the numbers killed. I wouldn't want to play down how tragic it is that 240 people died. But remember that this was a very, very terrifying event for people. And so it was assumed that this destruction would probably result in more deaths than it actually did. Perhaps this is a little bit of sensationalist reporting as well, and it was very difficult to get accurate news out of Spain at this time. So the assumption was that 6,000 people died, and that's the thing that stayed in the popular imagination of many people who heard about this. And yes, they feared that they would be next. We're now going to consider the World War II example of London. Why did the Germans want to bomb London in the first place? Well, initially, Hitler actually specifically had forbidden attacks on London, fearing that it would draw reprisal raids on German cities, and in that respect he was proved absolutely right. But at the latter stages of the Battle of Britain, when it became clear that the RAF was not going to be swept from the skies and the Germans were not unlikely to be able to invade Britain that year, the German bombers turned their attention to London, at first by both day and night, and later on purely by night. Create a mind map like the one I've laid out on the board here. The first part is government, then trade, industry, population, and geography. In some ways it might seem like a straightforward question, but in fact there are several key reasons as to why London was such a target. You should aim to produce a double-page mind map like this one below, and you will have about 3 or 4 minutes per slide to do this. In fact, you'll be timing that yourself. I'll be instructing you to pause the video while you read the information. I'll read it to you as well and explain any points of interest or try and clarify things as we go along. So let's start by looking at the issue of government, once you've drawn your mind map, that is. So pause the video now and draw out your basic mind map now. Okay, good to go. Remember, you can colour code your mind map to make it even more memorable and even include some little illustrations if you like. Article 1. Government. London was and is the capital city of the United Kingdom. The Luftwaffe, that's the German Air Force, reckoned that the widespread destruction of the centre of government would seriously harm Britain's ability to continue fighting the war. On one end of this scale, British government and morale would be devastated if Churchill, his war cabinet, or even the royal family were killed. Churchill is pictured at the top right there. He's not making a rude gesture, that's his famous V for victory sign. At the other end of the scale, killing government workers and civil servants would slow down the government and make war harder to continue. A related issue was the fact that significant landmarks like Buckingham Palace or the Houses of Parliament might be destroyed. Indeed, in the picture on the right, you can see the Palace of Westminster or the Houses of Parliament have been hit by a bomb. This would harm civilian morale. Make some notes on your mind map now. Pause the video. Ready to move on? Okay. Here's a picture of St Paul's Cathedral. St Paul's was a real icon of London. Remember that St Paul's Cathedral was designed by Sir Christopher Wren and replaced the original St Paul's Cathedral, which was destroyed in the 1666 Great Fire of London. Here it is in the Second Great Fire of London, in December 1940. The streets of London blaze around it, and yet St Paul's rises from the ashes and from the smoke like a beacon of hope. This was a very much deliberate propaganda strategy, and much effort was put into saving important landmarks in London for the sake of the morale of the civilians. Trade. Although more famous for trading stocks and shares these days, London was Britain's most important port in World War II, although the Battle of the Atlantic was increasing the importance of Liverpool and Bristol. Destroying the docklands of East London would seriously harm Britain's ability to keep itself fed. Hungry civilians would be less likely to continue the fight, not to mention very unproductive in the factories. Raids might also destroy large stockpiles of weapons and supplies being taken off the ships. There was also the possibility of killing important dock workers too, slowing down the unloading of these ships. Pause the video and make any necessary notes that you want to make now. Ready to move on? Okay, let's have a look at the next topic. Industry. Check out the photograph first of all. This is a British Matilda infantry tank being moved out of a factory by a small steam engine. That will become significant in a moment. Although not famous for massive mills and factories like Manchester and Birmingham, London was an important centre of industry. Factories producing weapons such as the Woolwich Arsenal and the Enfield Small Arms Factory, hence Lee Enfield Rifle if you've been studying the history of warfare, were important war industries. Killing civilian workers would also lower morale and harm the production of vital goods, including war goods. London was also the centre of the British railway network, which was crucial for the nation's transport system. Check out this map of the railway network in around 1900. It is far more extensive than it is today, but notice how all of these rail networks seem to lead like veins towards the heart of London. That indeed is how the railway network grew. It started in London and then branched out as it got further and further away. So destroying the railways in London would have a serious impact on railway infrastructure for the entire country. Pause the video now and make any notes that you would like to. Ready to move on? Well, before we do, just for sake of interest, compare the network in 1963 when it was cut by the beaching axe, and then compare it to now. Yes, we rely very much less on railways today, but even still you can see that London is the hub of many of the nation's railways. Let's move on. We're now going to consider the issue of population. London was the UK's biggest city with 6.8 million inhabitants in 1939. Indeed, it was one of the biggest cities in the world at the time. When Stanley Baldwin reasoned that killing civilians alone could win a war, Germany and other nations agreed. Here the process is brutal and simple. Kill as many civilians as possible. Injure and maim as many civilians as possible. Maiming meaning the serious injury. And also make homeless as many civilians as possible. The resulting horror and lowering of morale would, it was supposed, be enough to force the UK to surrender. Although, of course, this didn't happen, nor did it happen in Germany. Pause the video and make any notes that you want now. Okay, we'll move on. When we're talking about the population, it is important to remember the victims of the bombing. Take, for example, this rather heartbreaking colorized photograph of an orphaned child. You can really see the shock still etched in his face as he nervously plays with the fabric on the back of a beloved toy. I think it's supposed to be an elephant. Anyway, this tragic image is very symptomatic of how civilians might have reacted to the shock of being bombed. Happily, I'm able to report that this little boy survived the war, and it turns out he lived quite a prosperous life afterwards. But it must have been a devastating start to his young life. We're now going to consider the geography of London and how this made it a target for bombing. Check out this map of southeast England and northern France. Ignore, if you like, the little symbols that represent RAF fighter stations, etc. This map was originally produced to teach about the Battle of Britain. Instead, notice the swastikas in France, which represent the locations of German air bases, all of them within easy reach of London itself. London is vulnerable in the southeast, and it did not take long for German aircraft to fly there. Indeed, about a half-hour flight would be sufficient to get there. Consider these as well. What on earth are they? They almost look like something out of War of the Worlds. Well, in fact, these are fortresses that were built out in the Thames estuary and fitted with anti-aircraft guns. The reason they were there will become clear soon. Geography. London could hardly have been in a worse place to defend. It was very close to German bomber bases in occupied France. Indeed, even German fighters were in range of London. Added to this, by approaching over the North Sea and Thames estuary, the bombers would spend limited time in range of anti-aircraft guns, hence the building of those Monsal forts that you saw in the previous screen. When bombers switched to night raids, the Thames would reflect moonlight and fires, showing the way to the centre of London like a map. London was easy to find, easy to reach, and easy to hit. On that note, pause the video and make any notes that you deem necessary. Ready to move on? Let's go. Bringing it together. Review the information on your mind map and answer the following. Explain why London was a vulnerable target for Luftwaffe air raids. You may also use the following in your answer: its geography and government. You must also use information of your own. Now, this is a 12-mark answer. That means it would be a good idea to explain some examples of the London's geography and government, but you don't have to use them. But as long as you explain 3 examples, including some from your own knowledge, you should be able to get 12 marks. Don't forget though, if there's an overarching theme or a most important reason in your view why London was a vulnerable target to Luftwaffe air raids, then do explain that too in a short concluding paragraph. Therefore, you are aiming for 4 short paragraphs. 3 discussing specific examples and reasons why London was vulnerable, and 1 short concluding paragraph. You should spend about 18 to 20 minutes answering this sort of question. A little bit more explanation. Vulnerable means open to attack and easy to attack, and the Luftwaffe is the German Air Force. As a final tip, just use 3 point example explain and link paragraphs to explain what made London a tempting target. Once you've completed that task, this will be the end of the lesson. So pause the video once I finish speaking, answer the question, and then you can move on to the next when you're ready. Thanks for watching this. If it's been useful, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for similar content. Thanks very much, and goodbye.